The morning of December 23, 1944, began with silence, the kind of silence that lives deep in winter, thick enough to feel against the skin. From the frozen crest of Senamps Hill, a German observer raised his field glasses and stared into a pale, brittle sky. The metal bit through his gloves. At first he thought it was nothing, just a shimmer on the horizon, maybe snow lifting on the wind. Then the horizon began to move. A low hum drifted over the trees. It grew layer upon layer until it rolled across the hills like a tide. Then he saw them, not a handful, not a squadron, hundreds. C-47s stretched wingtip to wingtip, black shapes carving their way through the winter sky in perfect formation. His throat went dry. He whispered to no one in particular, "Mein Gott, the sky, it's full of them." For days the Germans had believed Bastogne was a closed fist. They had sealed it off, cut the roads, waited as cold and hunger did their work. Ammunition low, supplies dwindling. They could almost feel victory sliding into their hands, but now the sky itself seemed to rebel. Through his lenses, the observer watched parachutes bloom. Red, blue, yellow, white. They spilled down like flowers over snow. Red for ammunition, blue for medicine, yellow for food. White for everything else. It was methodical, massive, relentless. It was not an act of desperation. It was a demonstration. Around the post, other soldiers gathered without speaking. The sound of engines said everything. This wasn't just a supply drop. It was power unapologetic and immense, hovering over them. They realized in that single, growing roar that they were no longer pressing a starving enemy. They were standing beneath a machine too big to stop. A week earlier, their confidence had been absolute. Before dawn on December 16th, 1,600 German guns had split the silence with 90 minutes of thunder. Shells tore into the forest. Operation Watch on the Rhine had begun. Officers promised that the Allies would break like rotten wood. Antwerp would fall. America's line would snap. On those narrow frozen roads, soldiers of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division had believed. They were told the Americans were soft, exhausted, strung out on a quiet front. A hard thrust would carve through like 1940. Bastogne was the key. Take it, and the Ardennes belonged to them. But this morning, staring at the sky, the numbers on their maps no longer mattered. They could dig trenches. They could count their shells. None of it could match this flood of iron and silk. The observer lowered his glasses. His breath smoked in the cold air. A sergeant muttered something bitter, but no one answered. It wasn't the kind of moment that left room for jokes. They all understood without speaking. Something had shifted. Far below in Bastogne, men of the 101st Airborne had been holding on by their fingernails, hungry, freezing, wrapped in thin jackets against the deep winter. They'd rationed everything, bullets, rations, hope. They had no illusions about their chances if the sky stayed closed, but then the hum reached them too. One paratrooper tilted his head back and squinted up through the frost. His face was cracked with cold, his lips split, but he grinned anyway. "Look at that," he rasped. "Santa's got wings." Laughter broke out, hoarse and thin but real. It wasn't the planes alone that lifted their hearts. It was the certainty behind them. Those parachutes said one thing louder than any speech: you are not alone. On the ridge, the German guns opened up. 88s barked. Black puffs spread across the sky. Machine guns rattled into the roar, but the formation didn't scatter. Planes burned, limped, fell, but they stayed the course. Even the wounded ones held on long enough to finish the drop before spiraling away. For every plane that vanished, 10 more pushed forward. The message needed no translator. You cannot starve what we can feed. The observer stared through the drifting smoke, and the thought settled into him like frost in bone. They weren't fighting just an army. They were fighting a nation that could pour its will into the sky, a nation whose factories fought as fiercely as its soldiers. When the last plane vanished over the horizon, silence returned. Snow drifted down, soft and careless, covering the parachutes that blanketed the fields. The men on the ridge slowly lowered their weapons. No one needed orders. They had heard the truth in the engines. The observer let the glasses fall to his chest. He didn't know how many more days this battle would last, but he knew the shape of the war had changed forever. That morning over Bastogne, history was written not in artillery fire, but in aluminum wings and silk drifting gently onto frozen ground. They had believed they were tightening a noose. What they saw instead was a sky that refused to let it close. Before dawn on December 16, 1944, the forest shuddered under the weight of an artillery storm. 1,600 German guns tore open the morning, hurling fire across a 130-kilometer front. the ground convulsed. Snow lifted into the air like dust, trees cracked, vehicles shook, and men who had fallen asleep behind their lines woke to a war they thought had already been won. In the command posts, German officers watched the clock with the confidence of men who believed history could be made by precision. This was the opening act of a final gamble, Operation Watch on the Rhine. Months of planning had gone into it. Hitler himself had demanded it, sold it as a single blow that would break the Western Front, split the Allied armies, and deliver Antwerp into German hands. To the generals, it was audacious. To the soldiers, it was intoxicating. In the frozen hills of the Eifel, columns of men and machines had crept forward through the darkness the night before. Tanks lumbered along icy tracks, engines muted beneath thick canvas. Supply trucks crawled forward with their lights blacked out, guided only by the dim glow of cat's eyes on the road. Soldiers marched shoulder to shoulder, silent except for the rhythmic crunch of boots on snow. Many of them were young, many of them believed. They had been told this offensive would be like the old days, when the Wehrmacht was a blade and Europe bent before it. The Allies were weak, complacent, stretched thin across a quiet sector. A knife thrust here through the Ardennes would split them in two. Bastogne was the crossroads. Take it, and the enemy would choke on its own logistics. The glory of 1940 could be reborn in the last winter of the war. At 5:30 in the morning, the artillery fire shifted, the signal for the infantry to move. German grenadiers rose from the treeline like shadows. They advanced through fog and snow, past shattered American positions that were barely awake to the assault. Small outposts vanished beneath the crush of fire before they could fire back. The offensive rolled forward with a terrifying speed, not because the soldiers were invincible, but because their enemy had not expected to fight here. Across the sector, American units were manned by tired formations sent to rest. Many of them were green, their lines thin. When the storm hit, it felt less like a battle and more like an avalanche. Communications lines snapped, roadblocks folded, convoys turned around in panic. It was, for a few brief hours, everything the German High Command had promised. In the headquarters of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, General Heinz Kakat stood over a map flecked with colored pins and grease pencil marks. He had rebuilt his division after it was shattered on the Eastern Front. Most of his men were Luftwaffe and Navy transfers with little infantry experience, but their morale was high. They had been promised supplies, new weapons, and the strength of surprise. His artillery units reported their guns were firing smoothly. Radio operators whispered updates like a prayer. At the front, tanks rolled over burning villages and snow-covered fields. Horses pulled guns through ditches frozen solid. Tracks groaned over narrow bridges. By mid-morning, German advance guards were pushing through gaps that barely existed the night before. Resistance flared and faded in minutes. For the first time in years, German soldiers felt like the hunters again. They had studied the terrain carefully. 7 main roads met at Bastogne. If they seized the crossroads before the Americans could react, they would choke off any Allied attempt to reinforce or resupply their lines. The way to the Meuse would be open. The way to Antwerp would follow. Victory would not just be strategic, it would be symbolic. As the sun climbed reluctantly through the gray sky, Kakat's troops pushed deeper. Some sang softly under their breath. Others gripped their rifles, teeth chattering in the cold. The promise of a swift victory warmed them more than any fire could. Officers told them the Americans would not fight hard. They were soft, lazy, overwhelmed. They would surrender or flee. For a time, the landscape seemed to agree. American positions buckled. Convoys jammed the roads west. Refugees stumbled through the snow. German troops pushed past abandoned equipment and empty gun pits. In some places, they advanced so quickly they left their supply echelons behind. The front was no longer a clean line. It was a fluid wave. German field commanders sent back reports in clipped, triumphant bursts. One after another, they marked progress on their maps and pushed forward. The plan was working. Bridges were seized intact. Road junctions fell with barely a fight. Prisoners marched to the rear in stunned columns. But even as the advance roared ahead, there were small signs in the snow, delays at crossings, pockets of resistance that didn't dissolve as quickly as expected, bridges blown just ahead of schedule. A few officers noticed, marked the anomalies in their notebooks, and said nothing. The weight of momentum made doubt seem irrelevant. At higher headquarters, Hitler's staff was already congratulating themselves. The surprise had been total. The Americans hadn't seen it coming. Every kilometer gained felt like vindication. Every report fed the illusion of unstoppable force. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division, rebuilt from ruin, now moved like it had never known defeat. Tank destroyers growled at the rear, guns gleaming under a gray sun. Officers barked crisp orders. radios crackled with reports of shattered enemy lines. Soldiers whispered about Christmas in Antwerp. They imagined warm barracks, food, a victory that would turn back the tide of the war. They didn't speak about what lay behind them, the months of retreat, the cities reduced to rubble, the Eastern Front bleeding them dry. For one cold morning in the Ardennes, they could believe again. But belief doesn't change the laws of war. They were advancing with borrowed time and borrowed strength. Their air force could no longer guarantee the sky. Their supply lines were stretched thin even before the offensive truly began. They were pushing a weakened machine at full speed, and the gears were already starting to grind. For now, though, none of that mattered. On this second day of the Ardennes offensive, they were on the move, cutting through tired American lines and chasing a dream drawn in ink on maps in Berlin. The winter forest echoed with the sound of engines, boots, and the brittle hope of a final victory. Before sunrise on December 18th, the roads that coiled through the Ardennes were alive with movement. German armor pushed west with a confidence that seemed unbreakable. The snow lay hard and bright beneath the treads of their tanks, and above them the forest shivered in the wind. Bastogne was the word on every officer's lips, the point where 7 roads met. Capture it, and the enemy's backbone would break. Supply routes, reinforcements, counterattacks, everything the Allies needed to hold the line hinged on that town. Hasso von Manteufel's 5th Panzer Army gave the order. Bastogne must fall before the Americans could react. The 47th Panzer Corps under Heinrich Freiherr von Leutwitz would lead the push, with the 26th Volksgrenadier Division driving straight toward the crossroads. Behind them, armored divisions waited like a clenched fist, ready to punch through once the gap was made. By mid-morning, German vanguards were racing toward their target. Villages fell in quick succession. Roads once quiet with the shuffle of winter became rivers of engines and iron. German commanders believed they were in control of the tempo, dictating the rhythm of the war again, if only for a heartbeat. But on the other side of those roads, something was beginning to stir. Orders spread through American rear areas with an urgency that cut through the cold. Bastogne had to be held. Within hours, the 101st Airborne Division, battle-tested, weary from their campaigns in France, was loaded onto trucks in Reims and sent racing through the frozen night. Men wrapped in thin jackets shivered in open trucks, breathing white clouds into the dark. Few of them knew exactly where they were going. They only knew the speed of the journey meant it was bad. The Germans, still flushed with early victory, were convinced the road to Bastogne would be open. The American front line was collapsing fast. Infantry units were scattering. Bridges were being abandoned. For a few days, momentum was theirs. They didn't see the shape of what was waiting for them. As the 26th Volksgrenadier pushed forward, resistance stiffened. Roadblocks began to appear. American engineers blew bridges ahead of advancing columns. Tanks crawled around craters in the road, while small units fired from behind tree lines and slipped away. It wasn't enough to stop the attack, but it slowed it. In Bastogne, the Screaming Eagles arrived just 4 hours ahead of the leading German elements. They were exhausted, underdressed for the brutal Ardennes winter, short on supplies, but they dug in fast. Foxholes gouged out of frozen earth. Machine guns sighted on crossroads. Every road that led into the town was wired, mined, or covered by fire. They weren't here to retreat, they were here to hold. By December 20th, the German advance had done what it set out to do. Bastogne was surrounded. Every road leading in and out was cut. The ring was closed tight. Inside were roughly 22,000 American soldiers. Outside, 5 times that number waited. Leutwitz's staff saw it as simple arithmetic. With the town encircled, the defenders would run out of food, ammunition, and hope. A week at most, they said, maybe less. It was Stalingrad in reverse, and this time the Germans were the ones outside the wire. Inside the perimeter, things looked different. The men of the 101st Airborne knew they were cut off. They also knew retreat wasn't an option. Shells cracked against the edge of town, snow kicked up by mortar blasts. Medical supplies were already running low. Many of the wounded had no morphine. Field medics wrapped bandages in the cold and whispered to men shaking on stretchers. But the defenders were not panicking. They were buying time. They understood Bastogne wasn't just another town. It was the knot that held the entire front together. If the Germans seized it, they would choke the Allied line. If the Americans held, the offensive would slow, then crack. The German lines swelled with confidence. Columns of armor pressed closer, digging in around the town like a tightening noose. Shellfire echoed through the woods at night, a dull, endless heartbeat. German officers walked the frozen perimeter, already speaking about the next objective. Their confidence grew with every hour of silence from the sky. The weather was their ally. Fog, snow, and low clouds kept Allied aircraft grounded. Inside Bastogne, the air was thin and cold, filled with the smell of oil, blood, and damp wool. The men huddled around tiny stoves and empty ammunition crates, passing around scraps of chocolate, bits of bread. The wounded lay in cellars that smelled of earth and kerosene, but they still held their lines. The Germans knew time favored them. The Americans knew time was the only thing they had to give. Lutwitz's staff saw it as inevitable. They would starve the defenders out, crush the pocket, and open the road to the Meuse. All that remained was the formalities. On the ground, the ring around Bastogne grew tighter with each passing day. Mortar teams adjusted their fire. Tanks dug into hull-down positions. Snipers found perches in the tree line. Artillery units registered every approach road to the town. The trap was set. For the Americans inside, every sunrise was a reminder of what was coming. The ground was frozen solid. The trees were bare. There was nowhere to run, but their resolve stiffened with the cold. They had their orders. Bastogne would not fall. The Germans saw a trapped enemy. The Americans saw an anchor point. Both were right in their own way. But neither side could yet see what the sky would bring. On the 22nd of December, the gray winter morning was still and quiet, the kind of quiet that belongs to a battlefield right before someone tries to end it. From the southern approaches to Bastogne, 4 German soldiers advanced toward the American lines carrying white flags. 2 officers, 1 major and a lieutenant, walked at the front. Their boots crunched on the frozen road as they crossed into no man's land. Behind them, the mist lay low over the snow. In the distance, the steady crack of rifles had fallen silent. The Germans believed they were walking toward a surrender. They carried a neatly typed document in English and German, folded carefully in a leather briefcase. In their minds, the numbers were irrefutable. Bastogne was surrounded. 7 roads cut, artillery and tanks in place. The Americans inside were cold, undersupplied, and outnumbered 5-1. In Berlin, they would have called it checkmate. At the American lines, guards watched them approach and raised their weapons. After a short exchange, the Germans were blindfolded and escorted through the snow to division headquarters. The tension around them was taut and quiet. Inside a basement that smelled of wet wool and smoke, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe listened to the message. The ultimatum was as formal as it was cold. The Americans were invited to surrender honorably within 2 hours. Refusal, it warned, would lead to total annihilation. Outside, German artillery sat waiting. Their commanders were certain the Americans would see reason. McAuliffe read the document once, then again. His staff waited. It was freezing in the room, the kind of cold that crept through boots and gloves. Nobody spoke. Finally, McAuliffe snorted, a short, hard sound, and said one word. "Nuts." The staff laughed, not the laughter of men who thought the situation was funny, but of men who needed to feel something other than the weight pressing in on all sides. They typed the single word on a reply and handed it back. When the Germans received it, they looked puzzled. Lieutenant Helmut Henk asked Colonel Harper what it meant. Harper told him plainly, "It means go to hell." The officers returned through the snow in silence. Behind their blank faces, there was disbelief. No surrounded force should be able to reject such an offer. To the German command, it didn't make sense. But inside Bastogne, it made perfect sense. If they were going to be crushed, they would not do it kneeling. That same night, the weather remained their enemy. The sky was a ceiling of gray and fog, keeping Allied aircraft grounded. Supplies were scarce. Ammunition was rationed. Men went to sleep hungry. Many didn't sleep at all, lying in their foxholes with frostbitten hands wrapped around rifles, listening to distant artillery. Medics worked with what little they had. In basements, barns, and makeshift aid stations, wounded men lay wrapped in blankets, their breath visible in the cold. Morphine was nearly gone. Bandages were scavenged from torn uniforms. Still, there was no talk of surrender. German officers studied their maps with satisfaction. Their armor waited beyond the tree line, fueled and loaded. The sky favored them. The Americans were trapped. It was only a matter of time. The days blurred together in cold and smoke. Each morning began with a thud of shells against the perimeter. Each night ended with silence broken only by the groaning of trees in the wind. German troops believed the ring would hold, and eventually the defenders would break like ice under a boot. But inside that frozen pocket, something harder than fear held the line. Discipline, pride, stubbornness. McAuliffe's one-word reply traveled through the trenches like a match touched to dry paper. Nuts. It wasn't just a joke, it was a declaration. Around campfires built from stolen fence wood, paratroopers muttered it to each other. They whispered it when shells exploded nearby. It became a small, defiant shield against the cold. German artillery units brought more guns forward, 88s, howitzers, mortars. Everything was in position for the final push. The siege tightened. Commanders walked their lines with quiet confidence. They had crushed armies before. They would do it again. The Americans had no illusions. If the weather didn't change, their chances were thin. Every crate of ammunition counted. Every bullet mattered. Patrols were reduced. Counterattacks were limited to the absolute minimum. They were conserving strength, waiting for something beyond their control. The winter pressed on. The wind cut through clothing like knives. There were no roaring fires in Bastogne, no warm barracks, just the weight of winter and the knowledge that the enemy waited in the woods. But belief is a strange thing in war. The Germans believed the siege was almost over. The Americans believed something else, that they would not be the ones who gave in. For now, the snow held the lines in place. The next morning, the sky would decide who it favored. At dawn on December 23rd, the sky cleared for the first time in a week. German troops shivered in their foxholes, stamping their frozen boots against hard ground. The air was sharp, the kind of cold that burned in the lungs. After days of fog and snow, sunlight spilled weakly across the Ardennes, washing the landscape in pale gold. Soldiers looked up instinctively, grateful for a moment's warmth. Then they heard it. The distant hum began as a single note, barely perceptible against the wind. It grew steadily, layer upon layer, until it filled the valleys with a living, rolling thunder. The sound was unlike anything they had heard in days. Men turned toward the horizon, squinting through the light. The hum became a roar. And then the planes appeared. Hundreds of them, C-47s stretched in long, deliberate formations, their engines grinding through the cold air. The first wave swept overhead at low altitude, tight and unwavering. The second wave followed close behind. From every ridge, every foxhole, every trench, German soldiers stared upward in silence. Parachutes blossomed against the blue like an orchard of silk. Red, blue, yellow, white, hundreds of them unfurled in slow motion, drifting downward in great swells. Ammunition, medical kits, food, fuel, warm clothing, everything the defenders needed to turn a siege into a fortress. Anti-aircraft crews scrambled to their guns. The sharp crack of 88s shattered the stillness. Flak burst around the lead formation, black smoke hanging like bruises in the air. Machine guns stitched lines of fire upward. A few planes wavered, trailing smoke, some breaking apart, but the formation didn't scatter. Even the damaged aircraft held their line long enough to make the drop. For every plane that went down, 10 more kept coming. Below in Bastogne, American soldiers lifted their heads from their foxholes and watched the sky open. They had been cold, hungry, running low on everything that mattered. The night before, men had whispered in the dark, wondering how much longer they could hold. Now, they stared at parachutes with the kind of raw relief that cut straight through exhaustion. One paratrooper, voice ragged, muttered, "Well, I'll be damned." Someone else laughed. It wasn't joyous laughter. It was survival laughter, the kind that comes when the world doesn't end after all. Supply bundles hit the snow like salvation. Men ran through shellfire to cut parachutes loose. Ammunition was hauled to gun pits before the silk even settled. Medical kits disappeared into aid stations, still smelling of blood and cold. Artillerymen loaded fresh shells, firing them minutes after they'd fallen from the sky. For the Germans, it was a different kind of silence, a hollowing one. They had believed the ring around Bastogne was iron. Now they understood it was smoke. German officers stared through binoculars, their breath fogging the lenses. What they saw didn't look desperate, it looked methodical. A machine feeding itself with the precision of a factory line. Their Luftwaffe couldn't have mounted a drop this large anymore. Their fuel tanks were dry. Their formations were thin. Their skies belonged to someone else. As the morning stretched on, the second wave arrived, this time with gliders in tow. Heavy supplies, surgical units, vehicles, blood, the kind of logistics most armies could only dream of delivering under ideal conditions. The Americans were doing it in the middle of a siege. By early afternoon, more than 240 planes had passed overhead. German flak gunners had emptied magazines until their hands were numb, but the result was the same, parachutes everywhere. For the men trapped inside Bastogne, this was not just resupply, it was proof that someone far away hadn't forgotten them. Proof that the skies belonged to their side. Their morale surged in a way no shell or bullet could touch. For the men outside Bastogne, it was something colder. They realized they were not just fighting soldiers. They were fighting an empire of steel, oil, and endless production. Then came the fighters. Thunderbolts screamed in low, slicing runs, their engines splitting the cold air. They struck German convoys on the surrounding roads, rockets streaking into fuel trucks, machine guns hammering columns that had moved freely just a day before. What had been open routes became killing grounds. Supply lines stalled, vehicles burned. German soldiers dove for cover, their breath tearing out of them in white clouds. Every movement in daylight became a risk. What they'd gained in 7 days could be undone in one clear sky. By nightfall, the psychological weight was complete. They had thrown everything into surrounding the town. They had counted on the weather to keep the enemy grounded. Now that shield was gone, and above them hung a reminder of what they could not match. One young German private sat on the edge of a trench, his rifle across his knees, staring into the empty sky. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Every man around him felt the same thing. For the Americans, this day would be remembered as the moment hope fell from the sky. For the Germans, it was the moment they saw defeat coming, not in a speech, not in a gunfight, but in the rumble of engines they couldn't silence. The siege was no longer their story alone. The sky had claimed it. Christmas morning came before sunrise, wrapped in mist and gunpowder. The ground was brittle with cold. German armor waited at the edge of the woods, engines idling in the dark. Crews huddled inside their tanks, breath fogging the metal. Orders were whispered instead of shouted. This would be their moment. Leutwitz's men believed the town was weakened. They believed the Americans were running out of strength. They were wrong. At 4:30 in the morning, the offensive began. 18 Mark IV tanks rumbled forward through the snow, their black silhouettes sliding across the frozen fields. Infantry trotted alongside, rifles clutched tight against their chests. Shells whistled overhead, slamming into the American perimeter in bursts of fire and earth. The first line of foxholes shook. The 327th Glider Infantry caught the brunt of it. For a brief moment, the German spearhead punched through, flames licking at the edges of the town. Paratroopers scrambled out of dugouts, rifles in numb hands, boots slipping on ice. The sound of tank tracks on frozen ground was deafening, a heavy mechanical heartbeat pressing in closer. The Americans had been waiting for this. Artillery crews who had spent days conserving shells now moved with machine-like precision. Ammunition that had fallen from the sky just 2 days earlier was slammed into gun breeches. The line lit up. Anti-tank crews, hidden behind snowbanks and ruined walls, opened fire. Muzzle flashes tore through the dark. The first German tank shuddered as a round punched through its side armor. Flames blew out of its hatches. The second ground to a halt after its track snapped under a direct hit. The infantry behind them faltered, caught in a storm of rifle and machine gun fire. The Americans were cold, hungry, exhausted, but they were not broken. A German lieutenant stumbled forward through the smoke, shouting to rally his men, but the sky answered him instead. The roar of American artillery rolled over the field. Mortar bursts rained down. By dawn, the spearhead that was supposed to crush Bastogne was being dragged back into the trees, burning tracks marking its retreat. Not one of those tanks survived the day. Inside the town, the defenders stood in their foxholes, steam rising from their mouths, staring at the wreckage on the horizon. The attack that was meant to end them had failed. The cold didn't feel quite as sharp anymore. Leutwitz's staff still tried to keep their optimism intact. They told themselves it was only a setback. The Americans were still surrounded. Reinforcements were thin. A new assault could be prepared, but there was something different in the air now. The skies were no longer theirs to count on. The Americans could feed and arm their men. Every delay tilted the scales further away. On the 26th of December, the sound of engines came from the south, not German this time, but American. 4th Armored Division spearheaded through the German lines, tanks growling through churned snow and mud. Their arrival wasn't heralded by ceremony. It came as a rumble that grew louder until it felt like the earth itself was shifting. At 5 in the evening, as the light drained from the sky, the first tanks broke through to Bastogne. The defenders rose from their positions and watched the columns roll in. They were filthy, frost-bitten, hungry, but when they saw the star on those tanks, they knew what it meant. The siege was broken. The Germans had fought for this town with confidence, calculation, and desperation, but they had underestimated time, air power, and the will of the men inside those frozen lines. Leutwitz's units fell back under growing pressure, their assault blunted, their momentum gone. The Ardennes offensive was no longer a surge forward. It was beginning to unravel. In the days that followed, the statistics would tell the story in cold numbers. Over 1,100 tons of supplies had been delivered by air, thousands of artillery shells, food for 15,000 men, winter clothing, gasoline, surgical units, all while the German army had delivered nothing from above. But in the mud and snow outside Bastogne, numbers didn't matter. What mattered was what the men had seen with their own eyes. Paratroopers who had once been down to their last clips of ammunition were now loading crates stacked waist-high. Medics who had wrapped wounds with rags were now working with real supplies. Tanks that had once been stalled were roaring down the roads. And the Germans, who had once felt like hunters, now felt the walls closing in. For the men who had watched those skies fill with planes on December 23rd, the battle's outcome was never really in doubt after that day. The siege was broken not by a single charge or speech, but by the relentless weight of air power and industry pressing down from above. As night settled on Bastogne on the 26th, the defenders didn't cheer. They were too tired, too hollowed out by the cold and the fight, but they understood. They had endured the storm, and the storm had broken on them like a wave against rock. For the Germans, the dream of splitting the Allied line had ended on the same snowy roads where it began. What they had believed would be a swift victory had frozen, shattered, and dissolved under the weight of a sky they no longer controlled.